Cameron, thanks for joining me today to discuss your new paper that came out. We call it the safety claims paper. What is this paper about?
So this paper investigates safety claims, really, that we hear about the abortion drugs very commonly. And we hear them across a lot of venues, not only social and mass media, but also from politicians in legal cases. We hear them offered in front of the Supreme Court. We also hear them from research groups and medical societies that all claim something about the safety of mifepristone. In a particular way, offer comparisons regarding that safety to other common drugs. Tylenol, penicillin, Viagra, and NSAIDs usually.
All right. So, how do we get to this point for this false narrative to be out there for, I think, nearly 2 decades?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So this paper looks into the origins of the arguments as they're offered right now. And so when we characterize these arguments, we look at how these comparisons are being made. And I'm sure we'll get into the mechanics of what those comparisons look like. But what we see is that from the beginning, this type of comparison was offered on very rare and sporadic occasions by folks that were trying to communicate what they perceived to be the safety of the abortion drugs. And so we see it in a newspaper editorial that was talking about a death of a teenager that had taken mifepristone and relating it to death rates in another common drug. We also see it in editorials in peer-reviewed journals early on, close to mifepristone's approval in the early 2000s. Again, trying to communicate, these authors were lamenting that mifepristone was viewed as a dangerous drug. And so it was an attempt to reframe the discussion around its safety into what we'll talk about, I'm sure, are reductionist and simplistic frameworks of how we should think about drug safety.
So, I guess the basic question, can you actually compare abortion drugs to Tylenol or Viagra or any of the other drugs in your paper?
You should not do that, no. And so
And
what this...
so why can't you compare them? What's the real reason behind it?
Yeah, so the scientific and the regulatory expectations for these comparisons are very clear. The first expectation is that when you're comparing drugs, you're comparing two drugs that are used for the same indication or the same purpose. And so right away, we can say that none of these common drugs to which abortion drugs are compared, Tylenol, penicillin, Viagra, none of these are also abortion drugs. And so right away, we have an invalid comparison, something that does not pass the scientific standard, something that the regulators would not approve as a legitimate comparison for these drugs. And it follows then that the types of studies that we would expect to back up this claim, which are head-to-head trials, also have as the expectation behind them that you're beginning with two drugs used for the same purpose. So you can't even conduct the proper study here, let alone draw the comparison.
Can you just repeat that one phrase for me? You can't compare abortion drugs and Tylenol and Viagra because
Tylenol, Viagra, penicillin, and NSAIDs are not also abortion drugs. And that's what this boils down to.
So you can't compare the drugs if they're not used for the same purpose.
Right. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. It's pretty cut and dry. Part of your paper covers FDA regulations.
Yeah.
What are the regulations and why are they so important?
Yeah, so the early part of the paper actually discusses FDA regulations because it's a really helpful descriptor of both what we expect and what constitutes. The FDA spends a lot of time talking about what constitutes a false, lacking in fair balance, or otherwise misleading comparison. Those are their words. It gives a bunch of points of how we can think about these comparisons. And it's a really helpful framing for us to step through that logic, which is translatable, right? This is not a particular arcane rule that only applies in certain circumstances. This gives us a framework for thinking about comparisons and asking, are they legitimate? Are they appropriate? Are they valid? Or on the other hand, are they false, lacking in fair balance, or otherwise misleading? And so what we can see, we said earlier that these types of comparisons already violate this primary expectation of drug comparisons, that you're comparing two drugs used for the same purpose. But we can also then take the next step and say, what evidence is being offered and how does that stack up against what the FDA would call false, lacking in fair balance, or otherwise misleading claims? And what we see in the paper is that a lot of the logic, a lot of the data that is offered for these comparisons does actually satisfy those criteria for false, lacking into balance, or those misleading claims.
I have to ask you, since you're a scientist, you're involved in the peer review process, how did these claims make it this far if they're not backed up by any good science?
Yeah, so we see these claims being offered a lot of places that are not peer reviewed, to be honest. And so this is certainly an interesting case study, I think, in the ways that these slogans and these catchphrases can kind of catch fire and disperse through a lot of venues. Certainly the media, right? But also analyses that are put out by research groups, social media outputs of research groups, and influential folks in the medical and research community, and also, as we said before, legal documents and politicians and the like. And so what we see is that there is this assumption, this internalized assumption that there is evidence. And a lot of times people will say that there is evidence. You'll see citations offered. But unfortunately, there hasn't really been that question to say, what do these citations actually tell us? Certainly, do they meet the standard? And as we've already discussed, they don't meet the standard that we would expect for such a claim. But then separately, what are these citations? What are the data points that are being offered? And do they allow us to draw any reasonable comparison? And the answer is that they don't.
And you went through every one of these claims and dispelled the myths that surround these claims.
So I took a look, yeah, so at the claims that have proliferated, right, that we've seen in all these venues that we've talked about. Some of them don't have citations at all, which is in itself concerning. But for the ones that do have citations, I pulled those out and I said, okay, what is the evidence that is on offer here? And briefly, what we can say is that the evidence, if you look into it, the evidence is something that the FDA explicitly says that you shouldn't do, which is that it takes a study from mifepristone over here and says, okay, well, here's something about its complications or something about deaths that are attributable to its use. And then it takes another study about Tylenol or NSAIDs or penicillin and says, here is, again, a death rate or a complication rate. And it just puts them together and says, okay, well, we can determine safety based on these two studies that were not done together. They were not done in the same groups of patients. They were not done in a controlled fashion. And for all of these reasons, they present something that is not at all scientifically or statistically sound.
Cameron, a key phrase you used in your paper is scientifically appropriate. What do you mean by that?
A scientifically appropriate study, which is the context there in the paper, right? So the idea there is that there is not any scientifically appropriate study or data to support these comparisons. And so scientifically appropriate here means that it conforms to the expectations of the scientific and certainly regulatory communities for making such a comparison. A scientifically appropriate comparison, this is something that the FDA would say about a scientifically appropriate study, is that it is properly structured to investigate the claim being made, it is well controlled, and it gives this result that other experts in the field would agree backs that claim. And so the evidence that is offered is not in any way that the paper details why exactly that is. But here a scientifically appropriate comparison would start from the place of a head-to-head study taking two, in this case, drugs used for the same purpose.
So what you're telling me is not only do you not approve of these claims being made, but the FDA would not approve.
That does, yes, as you look at their regulations, I think it is inevitable that you come to the conclusion that both the evidence that they would expect cannot exist here and the evidence that is offered does not meet their standard.
Can you give me the key takeaways from your safety claims paper?
Yeah, I'd say that there are probably three takeaways that are most important. So the first is that there is a certain kind of evidence that we would expect, that the scientific community, the regulatory community would expect for a drug safety comparison. That type of evidence, the scientific investigation of that question, begins with the starting point of having two drugs that are used for the same purpose. So it is scientifically inappropriate and invalid to compare abortion drugs to drugs that are not used to cause abortions. And so right away, we can say that these comparisons are inappropriate and invalid. But the second and the third points require that we take a look at the data that is offered and we ask some questions of it. The second point that we can say is that by and large, these comparisons reduce safety to something very simplistic. Typically, it's only death in the individual taking the drug. We certainly know that safety is more complicated than death. And drug safety comparisons in general run a risk of collapsing safety considerations. And here they definitely do that. And that does not help us to fully understand the important safety considerations of any drug. And the third thing that we can say is that the data that is offered is not good data. It's not strong. It does not hold up to scrutiny. We see that as we look at those FDA criteria for false or otherwise misleading comparisons, a lot of that is concerned with the data that's used in the comparisons. And here, this data actually directly goes against FDA guidance in many different circumstances. And so it cannot properly support an understanding of drug safety.